The story is about a problem that NASA has and apparently has never discussed in any serious publication or in any NASA publicity or any educational materials. It seems that there is a very serious problem for astronauts operating in space, that their environment is so disorienting, because we on the surface of the Earth know that reliably there will be a sunset tonight at around 6 o'clock in the evening, and 12 hours or so later there'll be a sunrise. We have a built-in clock set by the rotation of the Earth in 24 hours. And so that's built into our entire being and has been our entire life. But in the space capsule, you don't have that. You have a sunrise and a sunset every 90 minutes. So your whole sense of time is warped. In addition, in the spacecraft, you don't feel the pull of gravity. You have no weight. And it's disorienting because we take it for granted that we know where our down is. I know where my down is. It's under my chair. But if you have no weight, then you have to figure out from things around you where you are. And so you're in a very disoriented state, and nothing works casually and easily the way you're supposed to, and you're basically disoriented. Now, this gets at its extreme danger on extravehicular activities, when you're not in the comfort of your capsule, but you're out in free space, connected by only a thin tether to the capsule. And astronauts in this dangerous and disoriented place sometimes lose their conscious connection to their eternal being, and their consciousness slips into another creature's conscious being. So Edgar gave me, as an example, an elephant. He said, if I were the astronaut, I would suddenly feel that I was an elephant in the Saharan desert. And it's not like I saw a picture of an elephant in a desert, but rather it is that I had the experience of being there and of knowing, usually when those two distant mountains are perfectly lined up, then when I see them from this region, I usually find my watering hole. There's a big tree, like a flag next to it, and I'll have my water and be fine, but I don't see my watering hole. This is awful. I'm scared. I could die from this. So the astronaut is feeling terror while he's supposed to be paying attention to his space mission and try to remove a old camera instrument, put it in his pocket, and install a new upgraded detector package on the Hubble Space Telescope or something of that kind. So Edgar said there is a serious problem of working in space and not having your reference to the feeling of time and the feeling of down. And somehow that can cause your feeling of consciousness to wander away from you, and for your brain to tune into somebody else's or something else's consciousness.
Wow,
It
that's
says so much to me about the nature of consciousness.
yes, doesn't it just?
Welcome back to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. Luciano here is your host, Nick Cook, and our friend Rudy Schild as well. So this would be our official part 2 of this discussion. Nick and Rudy have been past guests as well. That's why I use the word friend for both. For the audience, before we get right into it, there is a reason, selfishly, that we'd like to have Nick and Rudy on the show. Both are truth seekers in their own right, and question makers. So the questions that they ask and try to answer and search create more questions, and it's those questions that we like to follow, that we get excited about. We profess to know nothing here. So Rudy and Nick know so much more, but they're also never satisfied, and that I think enriches the conversations that we have with them. The fact that they are never satisfied with what they do know, but that drives them to ask more of the same questions. Nick, in one of his last blog posts, right in the middle of it, he said, "The world is not what it seems, and neither are we." And I think that informs a lot of what Nick writes about and has been writing about lately. Nick, let's start with you. What question would you continue with in the discussion here in this part 2 with Rudy that you think would help inform you on the question of who we are?
I've got so much to ask Rudy. It's hard to know where to begin. Even though we had a session, as you said, a few months back. I think if I can preface it with this, which is, since we last spoke, I had quite an illuminating conversation with a remote viewer,
Mm.
and he's a guy called Az Smith. And we both have Ingo Swan in common, because I knew Ingo back in the day, and Daz also, I think, had met or briefly worked with Ingo. And Daz posted through his remote viewing group a really interesting remote viewing session, which really opened my eyes to the whole plasma issue. And this was probably it was since we last spoke, so it's a few weeks back that he did this. And I put a post on my Substack about it as well, which was this. He had been tasked blindly, him and his group, to look at a target. And when they went into this target session, this remote viewing target session, he was confronted with an energy source. And this thing, he said, and his group concurred, it bloomed so suddenly. It was as if it had come through a tear in the sky, he said, through a portal. He also realized in this remote viewing session that there were two sets of observers on the ground. One set of observer was was quasi-military like. It was there with purpose, and perhaps had summoned this energy source, whatever it was. The other set of observers, he said, was rather startled and surprised by this sudden emergence of this blooming energy source, whatever it was. So now the big reveal. Afterwards, he found out that he had been tasked to remote view the orbs, or the drones, so-called, over New Jersey. So I'm sure you're both aware that in the latter weeks of last year, in 2024, New Jersey's skies were absolutely beset with strange phenomena. These craft were described variously as drone-like, but there were also aircraft in amongst them. So I read this with interest because I've had a thesis, and I think we might have touched on this last time. I've got a theory that many of the things that are reported as drones, anomalous drones in the sky, are not drones. They are plasma orbs. And these orbs have the capacity for mimicry, so that they can assume in some way, shape, or form, literally, the pattern or of something familiar in the sky. So what was of interest to me was, amongst the other descriptions in this remote viewing session that Daz did, was that the thing almost immediately assumed the form of a craft of some description, an aircraft or a drone, because it was conforming to a pattern of recognition in the brain of the observer, and I take this to be the untrained observers on the ground. The second set of observers mimicked the aircraft or the drone in the sky, and this bespeaks to me something deeply fascinating that I really want to talk to Rudy about, because in his paper, Rudy, you talk about plasmas and plasmoids being the manifestation of unbroken chains of quantum entanglement, which I really want to get
Yes.
into because it just sounds fascinating. We have no explanation, at least in unclassified circles, for what these plasmas and these plasmoids are. So I'm really hoping in this discussion between the three of us, we can get to the root of that, and talk to some of the other things that I really want to talk to you about, and so does Luciano, about Edgar Mitchell and Wilhelm Reich. But all of these things I think are entangled, if I can use it, if I can use that word.
Nice. Rudy, floor is yours, I think.
I believe that what speaks volumes and seems underappreciated to me was this experience reported by helicopter pilot on the recovery mission that described his very intensely felt experience when they were in the midst of a recovery operation trying to pick up an object which was understood to be a crashed or a grounded spacecraft or a something. And the salient fact that I think is so underreported is that the pilot, who was now in the seat of the helicopter, which was probably the kind of military helicopter where the pilot sits high in the craft, and then below is a large cargo space sufficient to carry 5 or 6 recovery specialists with their uniforms and with all of their gear. And that would be considered a complete recovery team. So the pilot of this was in some ways more closely associated with space or closer to space than the other members of the team. This a report by a gentleman, the pilot, named Jacob Barbar. And he reported that during the recovery operation, spontaneously, no warning, no premonition, no attempt to do anything at the moment, just controlling his helicopter, suddenly he was overwhelmed by an experience he had never experienced before or had never expected to happen to him. And it was an intense feeling of love, Love. He said it was so intense, and you could see in his emotion as he spoke, he actually broke down into tears when he recounted how intense was the experience of love. I can only understand that as his having accidentally or unknowingly owned the craft into the entanglement that joined the craft to its home station or to its remote civilization. And that His experience of love is a universal experience that will be the same in all people because we know of the unique waveform in quantum space that describes love. Wilhelm Reich, the discredited scientist, has taught us this and successfully experimented with it and uh, makes a compelling case that love is a quantum waveform, has a shape and a presence, and that it can reach high intensities as it evidently did. So to the point where the pilot basically broke down. Now that says to me that one, we have nothing to fear from aliens. They are driven and they are intensely experiencing love. That was the entangling property, the quantum property that created the entanglement and the connection between the spacecraft, the crashed spacecraft, we'll call it, and its remote civilization. So what I'm saying now is that entanglement is based on experience of emotion and potentially on human experience, which is the quantum property that is entanglement. There may be other entanglements of a kind I don't know, but this one gives me no fear. It tells me that an important property of the visiting aliens is the love that binds them to their home civilization. I feel as though that's underappreciated because there are so many people that are trying to raise fear of the alien population, of the remote civilizations that are in contact with us. And while such arousal of fear might be good for the defense budget, I think it is misleading us about our role and nature and of ourselves and of the rest of the universe. It is apparently an intensely loving thing. And we do our best, we're at our best when we participate in that with them. I can also comment that Susie Hansen, in her book, The Dual Soul Connection, describes what you might call a alien disco ceremony that she experienced inside of a mother craft above the atmosphere. And it again was a very expressive and loving experience that she describes fully in her book. So the answer to your question is that um, the experience of breaking entanglement exposes you to the intense quantum fields that are the basis of the entanglement, which was apparently guiding the craft that got downed for some reason, and that the military personnel on Earth were trying to recover at the time.
I really wanted to try to get to understand the nature of the plasmas and the orbs that you described, Rudy. So, I think in your paper it says plasmas and orbs are physical probes testing for guidance toward their distant connection. I'm not sure what that means, but before you go into that, because you will tell us what that means. My sense is that some of these plasmas are probes, as you say, from possibly very distant civilizations. I mean, physically distant in time and space. And because they are quantum entangled, there should be or could be a methodology by which a remote civilization from Earth can surveil Earth through these probes, through a kind of quantum entanglement. And I wondered if that conforms, or if that is what you are saying, in essence, in your paper, that there is these civilizations and technologies way in advance of our own are able to manifest these orbs on our planet, and through remote connection, through entanglement, are able to get instant feedback on us from these probes back to their civilization, wherever that happens to be. Is that in any sense, Rudy, a distillation of your view about what these probes are?
I'd say it's right on.
Great. Fantastic.
And I'd like to embellish a bit, if I might, Nick. There is an important aspect to all of this that I haven't brought up, and I don't think I brought up explicitly in the paper that I wrote. And that was, as you would have noticed, and I should perhaps apologize, it was incomplete because I wrote it quickly to send it to the Consciousness Institute in Tucson, Arizona, at the university there, University of Arizona. And they had invited me to be the plenary speaker at their Barcelona conference this year in Barcelona, Spain. Um, I had to turn the offer down because I consider myself too old to be traveling to foreign countries. I'd be an easy target for mischief if I were in a strange city. And I told them I would participate as a Zoom call, but not make a physical presence. And they didn't get back to me. But I wrote down this to give a guide to the organizers of the symposium as to what I was interested in and working on now. I um, didn't know whether I would eventually write this up in more detail for the conference proceedings or whether this would morph into a scientific paper. So you will see it was incomplete. I wrote down reference when I didn't give the detailed reference because I hadn't looked it up yet. I was just writing as fast as I could. And so the paper, as you saw, it is incomplete and is yet to be completed when I find an opportunity to have it published. Anyway, that explains how we got to here, but I'd like to say now about more about the question you ask: what is the plasma, and why do we see what we see? Now, in my understanding, the entanglement, remember, is a shared quantum property along the path between the distant civilization and our Earth. But we now know and understand as astronomers that there's a hell of a lot of junk along that path. And in particular, the most problematic will be gravitational lensing. You see, the gravitational lensing caused by the dark matter of the universe, which I have identified to be the baryonic dark matter, organized as a network of primordially built planets that condensed from the expanding gas cloud of the Big Bang. Now, what I have observed with my telescope is that when one of these planets gets along the line of sight between me and thee and the remote civilization, then space gets curved, and two things can happen. In rare cases, it can get intensely amplified, but in the more likely case of a near miss, it's likely to be deflected. And because that's a gravitational or physical situation in the universe, it has a quantum signature, and therefore the quantum field of the universe, which is carrying the entanglement gets broken off. It's almost like you see the entanglement being a wormhole with a funnel at both ends and then a long funnel in between. But suddenly a planet goes along that line of sight and shifts that entanglement by physical space being curved a little bit away from its connection. And so this leaves behind the stub, the unfulfilled part of the entanglement. And that then is apparently trying to seek um, the connection it formerly had. And that's why you're reading that these orbs and plasmas often seem to show living like behavior. That has been described especially well by Dr. Von Joseph in his paper about things that he finds on Mars and the entanglements and plasmas that appear on NASA footage, which has been screened or filtered out from them so that the NASA footage that is relevant to this just shows a blur or just shows a blank screen that you can't make sense of. But by removing that blocking, it might be adding noise to the signal, probably adding noise to the signal, but noise can be filtered out again. So um, we see entanglements in Dr. Ron Joseph's paper with me, and we know therefore that um, entanglements entanglements tend to try to recomplete that connection and make the wormhole complete again, so that now the spacecraft, the downed spacecraft, is again in contact with the host civilization. So the astronomical events going on modify the purpose and the endeavor of the remote civilization. And that's a problem that they try to repair at the host civilization, and that the plasma appears because in trying to repair that misconnection, a common quantum object or a quantum geometrical object is apparently projected and through the entanglement in the hope that some way the other half of the funnel or the entanglement will recognize, oh, that's where the entanglement is now, and we have to manage to get our quantum experience reconnected at that. So I see the plasmoids and orbs as attempts to make the ending of the entanglement visible to allow a reconnection, hopefully. Does that
Wonderful.
make sense?
Yeah, it does, but I'm gonna push you a little further, which is, so are these plasmas, these orbs, standalone entities that act as surveillance probes? I mean, we all know, we've read, we've seen, you even mention it yourself, that these orbs are seen over some quite sensitive sites, particularly those that are associated with nuclear activity. Can you explain the mechanism there? What are orbs doing there? Are they remote probes? Do they come from a distant civilization? Do they function as relay systems back to their host civilization? Perhaps you could touch on some of those issues, Rudy.
Okay. Thank you, Nick, for the invitation. And unfortunately, I can't answer many of those questions. I don't know in particular why we see them in the vicinities of nuclear power stations and military operations and military bases, especially ones that have nuclear capability and nuclear materials around. So I don't understand um, and don't know the answer to your question of why do they cluster around the sun. I've known about this because a gentleman named Bill Spicer um, pointed out to me that if you look with a pair of military binoculars that have a wider spectral coverage at the direction of the sun, but you do this by standing near the shadow line of a distant building and having the main image of the sun eclipsed by the building, and then you see the atmosphere of the sun, and there you see many of these spacecraft objects, which Bill Spicer says sometimes it seems like they're at war with each other or interacting with each other in ways that he sees as possible warfare. It might be that they're all looking for an entanglement with the nuclear facility, and that they're all trying to uh, suck or eat from the same trough. That I'm making that up now on the spur of the moment. I've never read that anywhere, and I'm uh, uh, speaking to you as where my brain is trying to go in almost as much confusion as yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rudy. I understand and I appreciate your candor in being able to say that, if you don't know, you can't answer that. Can I then ask you, though, about your essential point, which is there is a probe aspect to these plasmas, or they can have that kind of function here. And it's the thing that I'm trying to understand is the connection between the orb that we see here on Earth and its remote, distant host, if you like.
Yes.
Can you explain that to me in a little more detail? I'm trying to explain the chain of the chain of connection between the distant host, the link, the
Yes.
the the quantum
The
link,
entertain-
and the orb this end. I'd like to understand that, if I may.
I don't know what the distant funnel looks like. That is to say, again, going back to the image of a entanglement being something like what Kip Thorne at Caltech used to talk about a wormhole. There was a funnel at both ends and then a connecting tube or something, and but that was to do what we see in the quantum space. It instantaneously connects two points so that a consciousness experience at one end is reflected by um, some other or a related consciousness experience at the other end. And now I believe that the antics that we see by some of these orbs and plasmoids is an attempt to reconnect. And so they do this by making themselves recognizable, I believe. They make themselves have an ending which is recognizable by the remote end or funnel. And uh, it's hoped that that body will be able to um, create an entanglement that joins the two together through entanglement, which then puts together the complete wormhole again.
Okay, thank you very much. That's brilliant. But now, to what purpose? Why is this occurring? Why is there a plasmoid on Earth? And what is its connection to this distant civilization and the purpose therein?
I haven't read this anywhere. So, mind you, I'm telling you what my own personal experience and understanding so far is, and I'm plenty willing to learn if this is not correct or if it's partially right, but there's another important part that's involved, blah, blah, blah. The purpose of the connection is in my view probably that the remote craft is trying to share the experience of being at our location, which is their remote location, and send through entanglement the information about what's going on planet Earth.
Which is fascinating. So next question, and I'm just going on my intuitive reading. There's some data here, but my sort of intuitive reading of the data, based on multiple orb sightings and experiencer accounts of their encounters with orbs. These orbs seem to be able to read on multiple levels. So on a sort of multiple and on a very wide spectral band that ranges perhaps from the visible to the emotional. So they are actually reading the emotions of the things, to wit, in our case, the people they encounter on this planet. And perhaps you could surmise that they are sending that data back to wherever it is that they have come entangled with. So what we get, though, Rudy, in accounts of some of these encounters are, I know what you said about Jake Barber and his feeling of overwhelming love, but that wasn't, strictly speaking, in an orb encounter. But where you have orb encounters, you can get quite a wide variety of accounts for how the orbs made them feel, the people who were encountered, ranging from feelings of pure love that you described in Jake Barber's encounter to outright fear as well. And so whilst I wouldn't want to undermine in the slightest your view that all aliens are peaceful and loving, I want to try and understand how it is, in your view, in certain encounters, the opposite of love can be felt in proximity to them, which is fear. Do you have any sense for how we can have those two polar sort of extremes in encounters with orbs?
And first, Nick, thank you. That was very well said. In other words, your recounting of my attempt to explain was a little bit clearer than my own. And maybe that's why I'm just a chaotic astronomer and you're the guy who makes a career of explaining these things to people. So I congratulate you and encourage you for that. The reason I focused on love was that this rogue scientist, Wilhelm Reich, actually recognized the waveform that expresses love. Edgar Mitchell, when he was at Rangeley, Maine, and was seeing the apparatus from Dr. Wilhelm Reich's laboratory at Rangeley, Maine, and seeing a vacuum tube device. That is to say, it was a vacuum tube where they would put high voltage at the two ends and create a plasma type of discharge to the tube. And then I believe, but did not see this because there was nobody to demonstrate it or operate this. It's just a piece of apparatus. But I believe what he was doing was attempting to make the mind influence that plasma and demonstrate the mind's ability to change the plasma's appearance. I focus on love because he gave to us the waveform in which love is expressed in the quantum world. That is to say, in the mental, how is it? And the waveform is kind of a coil circling around, rather like the coil spring in an automobile. You know, the ordinary spring, what you call a spring, which is a little coil of metal. And you push on the ends that compresses. And and all that. Anyway, that is one form of the waveform. And interestingly, most of the ones that he seems to have recognized were on the scale of the human brain. That is to say, like 6 or 9 inches in size, which would be if the brain were working over its entire range of electrical activity, that would be an object that's radiating away about 6 or 9 inches in size, something in there. And so it's not surprising that the waves apparently propagate through the universe as waves of this size. Now, there's another kind of wave that Wilhelm Reich described, and it has a more universal function. I'm not so sure, but it's a wave that has a form a little bit like the waveform, except as it goes away from the brain, it's expanding. So it starts as brain size at the brain, but as it unwinds and unfolds, it gets bigger and bigger in diameter. That kind of a waveform will ride on the physical matter on all scales of the universe, from the human being and even down to the microtubules of the brain, to hear Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff describe it. This other waveform rides on the quantum physical properties of the universe on the scale of rocks, planets, stars, galaxies, clusters of galaxies, cosmic voids. Well, I don't know about the universe itself, but perhaps. Anyway, that is ever expanding and allows for many, many more kinds or intensities of waves because it has many degrees of freedom to achieve different sizes and different shapes.
I wondered whether in those orb encounters with experiences between a human and an orb, whether there was a reflective quality about the experience as well. So the orb, in some sense, isn't just sensing what is going on within the subject that is interested in, let's say, a
Yes,
human
okay.
being that it encounters, but is also, in some sense, reflecting back things that it sees in the observer, in the human being. So, because we have for all of those wonderful encounters, we have descriptions of encounters. I mean, I'm thinking particularly there was an amazing encounter which was documented by your colleague Ray Hernandez, when his wife, I think his wife was praying for the recovery of her
Yes,
dog.
of the dog.
And yeah, and an orb appears in their living room or sitting room, and it then takes on the apparition, the form of an angel or the Virgin Mary. And Ray's wife happily later reports that her sick dog, was cured. Now that was a wonderful experience. Conversely, I've heard of people in places like Skinwalker Ranch, for example, where they are pushing and probing as scientists what some of them see to be the presence of non-human intelligence. They're pushing and probing and poking, and often getting a fear response back from the orb they encounter. Now, I wonder if those two things are connected, insofar as the orb, in addition to sensing, might also be reflecting back some quality that it observes in the observer. What do you make to that?
I have thought about it, but not as deeply because didn't have as nearly so much data. And I think it's very salient, relevant that with his wife seeing suddenly angels and light. Um, I think it's likely that that came from her consciousness trying to engage this entanglement. So the way to her quantum mind processing was through religious experience. Was religion motivated or coached or religion phrased or expressed? And so you can see that the entanglement has everything to do with what's at the remote end. I think that you're correct that in general is to connect to their own um, beings or their own interests among our population. But at the same time, there are abnormalities. And I feel that it's my ignorance that I don't know what the expression or the waveform for hatred and fear might be, because I have always imagined that hatred and fear are emotions that arise within us who have become misguided in some way, and that the hatred and fear are more the absence of love. And then in the absence of love, then you have human emotion, and the human emotion can go can drift to hatred and fear all too easily. So that's the way I process this, but I am certainly not an expert because I don't have these experiences myself.
That's fascinating, and it sort of comports with my very crude sort of reading of this, Rudy. So I'm just going to flip it back for a second to that point where I opened with, which was to describe Daz Smith's remote viewing session of the drones in New Jersey. What interests me about that, and bear in mind, I come from an aerospace background, so I'm very interested in things in the sky. So, taking everything from the conversation we've had thus far, there seems to be both a sensing and a probing aspect to some of these orbs here. You could call them surveillance technologies or reconnaissance technologies in a way. But there is also, I think, from observing the data around them, an aspect to them that mimics. They do mimicry, just as that orb, which was confronted by Ray Hernandez's wife, saw something in her that made it manifest into an angelic form.
Yeah.
Do you remember when I described that party of observers on the ground that Daz saw in New Jersey? They I can imagine them looking up into the sky in wonder when they see a light in the sky, the appearance of this orb for the first time. And then in their minds, as you'd expect, they would go, oh, it's in the sky, so it's got to be an aircraft or a drone of some description. And then lo and behold, what does this ball of energy do? It then transforms very quickly, according to eyewitness testimony, into the form of an aircraft. Now, it has to be said that not always is that transformation process entirely successful, in that we have testimony, for example, that the navigation lights of these aircraft are slightly in the wrong place. There's something a bit off about the aircraft that these people are witnessing, which, given your scientific testimony on this, Rudy, that these are perhaps some of them are probes from light years away, is entirely understandable. There probably would be some translation errors between the the host dispatcher of the probe and the probe itself. But I guess the point I'm getting to is there seems to be this bidirectional quality about them. They're both sensing here, but also mimicking back. And actually, not that I want to go down a military path, but actually that's a perfect camouflage because if you manifest in the form of something which is expected to be seen by the
Oh, I see. Yes.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That is a pretty potent form of camouflage, actually. So anyway, I've sort of gone down a slightly aerospacey, militaristic path, and I didn't mean to. But shall we talk about Edgar Mitchell? I'd really love to, before we sort of close out, and I don't know how close we are to running out of time. I'd love to talk about your, and Luciano brought this up, your associations and relationships with Edgar Mitchell, a man whom I would really love to have met. Tell me about Edgar and his interest in all of this.
Sorry, Nick, let
Yes.
me interrupt very quickly because I'm with Nick. I want to know more, and on this podcast, Rudy has shared some stories about his friendship with Edgar and some of the experiences he had. So I don't want to go off that course, but I just want to add maybe a thought. Maybe it's not a question. Maybe it is. I don't know how it's going to come out, but just listening to you both back and forth on this discussion with plasmas, orbs, mimicry, fear, and love. You brought up a couple of times as well the example of Ray Hernandez and his wife and what they saw. For the listener and the viewer, by the way, Ray Hernandez, we did a couple of episodes with him as well. He's the one who introduced us to Rudy Schild to begin with, but he explains in detail what happened that day and what they saw in the living room. I ask myself this all the time. I don't know how to explain it. This is why we speak to people like Rudy and you, Nick. How much of what we view and what we feel from what we view is actually directed by our true beliefs, our belief system. So I ask this also because I know people who are very close minded and very rigid in their beliefs, fundamental in their beliefs. And when going through some of these experiences that are transformational for others, come back with more doubt, fear, and a retrenching in their beliefs. While others, not so fundamental, are open to the expansiveness of the experience and their belief system crumbles a bit, shatters, changes. Does the feeling of the love, does the feeling of the fear come from the actual um, adherence to that person's, that individual's belief system? And I ask this also because, excuse me, last point, I think, if we were to believe that we could direct and that we have a specific connection within the quantum entanglement to these orbs, to these things that we view that look like craft or look like the Virgin Mary or whatever it is, then how it can't be far fetched to believe that we are them. We can have dominion over them. We are amongst them ourselves. We just fool ourselves into not believing that because we have a bag of flesh and bones. But maybe we are part of that. I don't know. Don't know if that's a question.
I don't know who wants to go first, but since I've stumbled into this,
Nick, you go first.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll have a crack at what I think. I think it's very interesting what you bring up about belief systems and about those belief systems. What happens to an individual when those belief systems crack? And I think, therefore, that what you could say is happening in some of these orb encounters is a cracking of a belief system. In other words, you're looking at something that has no bearing on anything you know about the material reality that you've been, brought up in, educated about. So that might elicit a twinge of fear, which perhaps then could be reflected back at you, the percipient, by this orb. On a wider note, I think what is interesting, and I'd love to hear Rudy's views on this too, that these things, I mean, it is often said about UFOs and UAP, and particularly by, Jacques Vallée and people, that they are sent here in some way, shape, or form to challenge our worldviews about things and to melt some of our long-held beliefs in certain shibboleths of science. So I can imagine that that is perhaps part of their purpose, is to confront us in our beliefs about the material science paradigm that we happen to have fallen into over the past 250 odd years or whatever it is, and are challenging that directly by saying, or by showing themselves and going, here we are, we're an orb, I'm an orb, and I am challenging your belief systems, human being. And so I think perhaps they do have that role in amongst many roles, one of which would be as a surveillance system. And of course, my own view is, having studied as much data as I can on this, that this is a consciousness-driven universe, and that my form, your form, the human form, as in any material form, is an avatar of consciousness that is projected onto a screen of perception that is Donald Hoffman, a useful model for us to navigate this material reality that we just happen to have found ourselves in this incarnation.
If we are to believe, and on this podcast, we've had so many conversations with people who've had these experiences that would converge with what I'm about to say. If we are to believe that we are all small puzzle pieces to a larger picture, then we are shards of the same consciousness. Then what? Again, it's not far fetched to believe that Mr. Orb is also our consciousness, just in a different form, like we are. We're just in a different form, but we could be the same, and it could be the larger screen, as you said, the larger screen telling us, "Hey, that orb is you. Wake up."
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know either, but I'll buy that.
Okay, sold. Sold.
So,
Okay.
you were talking and addressing the concern about fear, and I believe that you're absolutely right that confronting firsthand phenomena that you cannot explain will tend to make you drift over to what you do know about the unknown and unknowable. And it also can be accompanied by a feeling of fear, because you suddenly feel the vacuum of, oh, I've been wrong about this all my life. That would
Right.
not be a pleasant emotion. And so I think that possibly one aspect of the fear that you talk about is that it's the absence of understanding and feeling whole and healthy yourself in relation to the universe, discovering that there is something wrong with your approach to the universe. And that could be unsettling. I
Well
don't
said.
know that we have actually know of a waveform of fear. Um, Edgar Reich didn't address this point because he was a medical doctor. All of his training was in medicine. And so he didn't, he could deal with the concept of love and healing and well-being, but he never really spoke about what is fear. And I'm left to assume that in his view, fear is essentially the absence of love. And I'm sure that that's an oversimplification, but my mind starts there.
Maybe we should have more of these conversations, Rudy, as well, because I know that in your oversimplification, I know that you have deeper thoughts on this side too. Uh, but I did not want to forget. I interrupted Nick a few minutes ago about introducing Edgar Mitchell, or maybe a
Yeah.
question that he had, leading question for you on Edgar Mitchell. Nick, please go ahead.
Well, this is, I know you guys have talked about Edgar Mitchell on previous conversations, but so this is a bit of a selfish one from me. But I found him, I have found him to be such a fascinating individual who's spanned so many of my interests, you know, coming from that aerospace background, being an aerospace engineer, then going into space, walking on the moon, having this consciousness backdrop to his life, that certainly the sort of second half of it, and also to have, you know, being partially, if not wholly, responsible for his quantum hologram theory about, you know, the universe being based on information. Those span so many of my interests that I have to ask you, Rudy, you know, what was he like as a person? And whether, I imagine there must have been hidden depths to Edgar Mitchell. And I've always wondered, and perhaps you can shed light on it, whether he ever encountered anything himself that was, I mean, I know he had paranormal experiences because I've read about
Yeah.
his
The
interactions with
samadhi
the,
experience.
but I'd love to know, did he ever encounter anything in space that was not of this world? Did he encounter anything on Earth that was not of this world? Tell me a little bit about Edgar Mitchell.
I did ask Edgar, when you were at the moon in your capsule where you orbited for a day or two, and so you had plenty of time to view the back side of the moon. I asked him, did you ever see anything that you considered to be um, not human in origin, or something of the core, or the kind of something that's obviously doesn't belong there? So signs of old excavation, perhaps, or of anything that would indicate other civilizations having been on the moon that we perhaps don't know about. Anything that's out of the ordinary. And his answer was a simple no.
Okay.
However, I would like to tell you that he did know some things firsthand that he rarely talked about, because they touch this sensitive nerve about, do we really believe in UFOs? And what about Roswell? Did Roswell really happen? And one interesting thing you should know about Edgar was that he went to Roswell High. He was a student at Roswell High. Uh, I want, however, now to tell you a story that he told me about the early days after World War II, when you remember reading and knowing that the paperclip scientists, that is Bernard von Braun, and the people he was leading in the German Nazi research programs on rockets for military purposes. Um, um, Edgar told me the story of how he was at that time in like 1947. I don't know. He didn't say the year. I infer it must have been 1947 or thereabouts. The paperclip scientists had been brought to the United States, and they were now being assigned to do further research with the V-2 rockets at White Sands Missile Range, which is in Alamogordo or near Alamogordo, New Mexico.
I know it well.
And oh, you do? And I believe that you would know then that it is also the site of the University of New Mexico's campus. And Edgar told me about the date when the astronaut corps that would evolve into the Apollo crew mission specialists um, were first meeting with these new American citizens and their missile program and V-2 rockets and so on. And so there was at that time at the university campus a reception so that the American astronaut corps could meet and welcome the new paperclip scientists. And so they were all standing around in a reception area, holding up their wine glasses and talking about how wonderful it was that you're here. And we look forward to wonderful research programs undertaken together. And we do seek your collaboration. And suddenly, in the middle of this conversation with Edgar Mitchell there present, a uniformed military officer appeared from some off-scene place and walked up to Edgar Mitchell, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Very important phone call, Dr. von Braun." Dr. von Braun followed the military officer out of the room, and we presume he picked up or was handed the telephone and called and took his call. And then Edgar Mitchell said, when he returned to the room, he was white, ashen faced, very, very troubled. And Edgar then enjoys to say with a little devilish smile, that was the day after the Roswell crash. So there was no doubt in Edgar's mind that Roswell happened. And according to the story that's been repeated about the cleanup crew and all of that, that's almost certainly all true. It fits the puzzle. And Edgar was there.
Great story. I love it. Really interesting.
Haven't heard that one. There was another story, Rudy, that you teased me about. I don't think I know about this. A story excuse me, the background is an MIT class where Edgar was taking questions.
Yes. I'd like to tell you about this because it's also revelatory of Edgar at his finest. Toward the end of his life, when Edgar was coming to Boston, he would occasionally call me on the telephone and ask me if I would be so good as to meet him at the airport and take him to some personal assignment here in the Boston area. And on one occasion, the assignment was that he was to attend a class at MIT. The subject of the class was space medicine. And the students there had been through the end of the entirety of their semester and now were presenting student theses that they had prepared. And they would give a vocal report on their student thesis with Edgar in the audience. And Edgar would say what he could about what the value of the thesis was and congratulations and all that nice stuff. But then after the presentations were over and before we were talking about dinner plans, um, the teacher of the course, who was also a friend of Edgar's, said, now I would like to turn it over to the class to ask Edgar whatever question they have about the lunar program, the mission, or anything they like. The floor is yours, students. And I remember that really only one student came forward and asked this question. Dr. Mitchell, when you were on the moon, what was the most surprising thing that happened to you? And Edgar replied, the most surprising thing was very frightening as well. He said, we were on the surface of the moon, and we know how the astronauts do that bounding walk thing. It's kind of like they hop right foot to right foot, but one step would be like 7 feet. And so after getting over the amusement of this, they were wanting to do the core of their mission, which was to collect interesting rock formations or to sample rock formations, find pebbles that were from there so that they could be taken back as a collection to scientists at home who want to do the geology of the moon. However, they suddenly realized, you know, we don't know where we are. Remember, in this bounding walk, you don't leave a nice little trail of footprints, and they didn't think to bring along a bag of peanuts. And they realized, whoa, we didn't expect this. You know, on the Earth, there's basically always a distant mountain or land feature that you can recognize from afar. But he said the curvature of the moon is so extreme, it's so much smaller than the Earth that you don't see a distant horizon. To make matters worse, they had landed their spacecraft lander in a mountainous region with volcanic structures because they deliberately wanted to sample these craters because they would have brought up molten material, presumably, that then spewed out and scattered some rocks that they could sample and get the ore samples or the perfect samples of old features of the moon mixed up with currently available moon rocks. And so they had no horizon at all. They just had these nearby craters everywhere they looked. And they realized they weren't sure they were going to get back to their spacecraft for the return mission. Well, they did. He dropped the story there. He didn't say what they did about it, but he did say at NASA, we were never trained for this. We never thought about this problem, that on the moon, there's no distant horizon. Your horizon is maybe 100 feet away because of the extreme curvature of the moon.
Wow.
And so that was the most surprising thing that happened to Edgar on the moon.
Amazing.
I know. Nick has to go, and we're closing out anyway on our agreed time together. I do have one more question, Nick. Allow me, please, if you have just a few more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Absolutely.
okay. And it's really a question. It's a request more than anything to relay one last story, Rudy, because this story I'm about to ask you to relay. You did already, obviously. It's the elephant story. And it's one
Huh?
that, it really tickled me, and I've repeated to many people, and I don't think Nick knows about it, but I would like for if you don't mind, take a few minutes
Absolutely. I'd
to
love to
recount.
tell this because it is so significant of what consciousness and our conscious process is. And so um, the story is about a problem that NASA has and apparently has never discussed in any serious publication or in any NASA publicity or any educational materials. It seems that there is a very serious problem for astronauts operating in space, that their environment is so disorienting because we on the surface of the Earth know that reliably there will be a sunset tonight at around 6 o'clock in the evening, and 12 hours or so later there'll be a sunrise. We have a built-in clock set by the rotation of the Earth in 24 hours. And so that's built into our entire being and has been our entire life. But in the space capsule, you don't have that. You have a sunrise and a sunset every 90 minutes. So your whole sense of time is warped. In addition, in the spacecraft, you don't feel the pull of gravity. You have no weight. And it's disorienting because we take it for granted that we know where our down is. I know where my down is, it's under my chair. But if you have no weight, then you have to figure out from things around you where you are. And so you're in a very disoriented state and nothing works casually and easily the way you're supposed to, and you're basically disoriented. Now, this gets at its extreme danger on extravehicular activities when you're not in the comfort of your capsule, but you're out in free space connected by only a thin tether to the capsule. And astronauts in this dangerous and disoriented place sometimes lose their conscious connection to their eternal being. And their consciousness slips into another creature's conscious being. So Edgar gave me, as an example, an elephant. He said, if I were the astronaut, I would suddenly feel that I was an elephant in the Saharan desert. And it's not like I saw a picture of an elephant in a desert, but rather it is that I had the experience of being there and of knowing, usually when those two distant mountains are perfectly lined up, then when I see them from this region, I usually find my watering hole. There's a big tree, like a flag next to it, and I'll have my water and be fine, but I don't see my watering hole. This is awful. I'm scared. I could die from this. So the astronaut is feeling terror while he's supposed to be paying attention to his space mission and try to remove a old camera instrument, put it in his pocket, and install a new upgraded detector package on the Hubble Space Telescope or something of that kind. So Edgar said there is a serious problem of working in space and not having your reference to the feeling of time and the feeling of down. And somehow that can cause your feeling of consciousness to wander away from you and for your brain to tune into somebody else's or something else's consciousness.
Wow,
It's
that's
so much to me about the nature of consciousness.
yes, doesn't it just? And did he reveal, Rudy, whether that was his own unique experience, or did he say that it related to other astronauts' experiences as well?
Edgar did not do the extravehicular activities that I'm talking about, like the repair and upgrade of the Hubble Space Telescope. So I believe I have always assumed that this was not his personal experience, but that he knew about it because, the guys were having lunch together every day.
Wow, amazing.
One of the most
Thanks
fascinating.
for sharing that story. That's fascinating. It's opened my mind to all kinds of new
Good.
perspectives.
I'd like to tell that story because it says so much about what consciousness is.
Rudy recounted this story last year to us, and it was, it was a mind blow. And now this is the second time he said it. It's no different. Like goosebumps.
Good.
I-
Thank you.
There are very few stories that are as mind blowing as that one there, in my opinion. Humble, but what do I know? Speaking of what do I know, which is nothing, other than the fact that we're now closing up, I do want to thank you both. Nick, you are an awesome co-host. So I learned from your question making, so thank you. And Rudy, thank you for taking all those questions and being a part of this. Two stellar gentlemen, thank you.
You're such a gracious host, Luciano, and I always feel embarrassed when I've, come on and I hijack your show from you. But it's been such fun talking with you as ever, and also with you, Rudy. Thanks for entertaining my questions patiently, and I've learned so much today as well, which is amazing. So thank you both.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Luciano.
To the next. Thank you, guys.